Welcome to the University of Maryland, Baltimore Office of Accountability and Compliance's podcast, Empowered. So thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us and talk with us, Dr. Peter Swaan. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
So Dr. Swaan is a professor of pharmaceutical sciences and associate dean for research and graduate studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore School of Pharmacy. He has taught professional and graduate students for over 20 years and has been on the advisory committees of over 50 PhD students. In his role as Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Studies, Dr. Swaan brings an expertise in student mentoring through teaching and course development in research methodology and ethics, critical thinking skills, career development, and interview preparation skills. We are delighted you could join us.
It's a pleasure.
So one of the things you teach at the School of Pharmacy is ethics. What are some of the issues you address, and how do you hope your students benefit from those issues?
Well, Stephanie, that's a very broad question, so I don't even know where to start. But I think ethics is important. It's a cornerstone of science, and I think if we take a step back and we look at the current environment that we live in, where everyone is doubting science, I think ethics is really important because unethical behavior is frequently noticed more than ethical behavior. So it's the few bad apples that lead the public to doubt science if they hear about ethical abuses, such as being paid by pharmaceutical companies to do clinical trials that are only positive and things like that. And pharmaceutical companies are very close to the heart of most pharmacy students, so I deal with that a lot. Yeah. So some of the issues that we talk about are, I think the first thing you talk about is what is good science, right? So how do you do good science? And good science is having good ideas and then designing experiments around that to test your hypothesis. And then, I think the crux of ethical problems comes in the area where you start interpreting your data. And how do you keep a objective position into an area that you've worked so closely in, and tell yourself, I'm not going to look at the results in a certain light. I'm going to be objective about this. And I think that's where some of these ethical concerns come in. I mean, I brought a couple of handouts to kind of guide myself about what we talk about. And so I always talk about publishing and perishing. So I'm also the editor for a major journal in the pharmaceutical sciences called Pharmaceutical Research. It's published by Springer Nature, so they have ethics high in their, in their standards. So I talk to the students about the 7 serious deadly sins of publishing. And so there are several things that we deal with. I mean, the first one is the most egregious of sins, and that's the data manipulation or falsification. In other words, just making up your data. And nowadays we have what people are not aware of, and this is also about education. You need to be aware of how do people detect whether people have made up things or whether they've manipulated images or data or things like that. And so we really have a good conversation about these things. This class is very interactive that I give to first-year graduate students and postdocs. And we basically all discuss several cases because I get a lot of case studies that people can look at. And then we just discuss, how could you have done this differently, or how could you have avoided this from happening? Because I think a lot of the mistakes that some people make are not always intentional. I mean, there can be unethical behavior that is not intentional. And so, of course, it's a fine line. It's like, do you take something that you find on the street, a $100 bill, or are you going to give it back to the person that that dropped it? I mean, if you see that person in front of you, yes. But, if it's just lying there, what are you going to do with that, right? So it's always a fine line. How are you ethical or unethical? So that's pretty much what we talk about. So we talk about other, unethical behaviors such as, publishing the same data twice, which you call redundant publication or duplicate publication. And then we talk about things like plagiarism, how the use of other people's words in your own papers. And what a lot of people don't understand is that that plagiarism of your own words can also be considered plagiarism. I mean, even the Supreme Court gave a verdict on that, I think about 10, 15 years ago, that you can't just use your own words and copy them verbatim, because if the copyright is given to the publisher, which happens after you've published something, you no longer own your own materials. So plagiarism is again it's a gray area, right? So how much do you copy? How original do you have to be in order to not for it to be considered plagiarism? And that can be very difficult. I mean, if you're a new student or postdoc and you write your first paper, where do you start? I mean, it's daunting, right? You have all this literature out there. And sometimes you just think, well, I couldn't have said it better myself, right? And that's one of those areas that you say, okay, well, but could you maybe dissect that sentence and say it a little differently? You basically have to teach people to not fall into that trap, because the flip side is that it will get caught, because nowadays all the publishers use software to check every single manuscript, and they check the internet, they check already published literature, they check websites. As one anecdote, sometimes I get manuscripts in that have 100% similarity with existing material. And that's usually because a dissertation, also in Maryland, once they get published by the graduate school, they're online. And the software will index that. And if you submit your paper after your dissertation arrives online, then of course you're going to have 100% similarity with something that's already published. But it's not really published. See, so as an editor, you also have to kind of keep an open mind as to where do you put that line. So again, it's a gray area, but it can also be a cultural thing. So some cultures find it respectful to copy someone's words or to give credit to other people. But there's an easy way around that. As soon as you put quotation marks around something that's been published before, you're fine. And I think that's something that we teach too, that as long as you're transparent about what you're doing, then things are fine. It's the same thing with the other sin in publications. It's conflicts of interest, right? Mm-hmm. If you declare all your conflicts, there is no conflict. I mean, it's open for people to judge whether you have a significant conflict or not. And so I think for the students, it's important to realize how to navigate this, these treacherous waters of publications and how to write their papers and what to do and what not to do. Doing that in their first year, I think, is the best way of tackling that. And of course, there's other ethical issues too that we discuss, such as animal human use abuses. Most people will have an internal board. Like, for example, in Baltimore, we have the IRB, which is the Institutional Review Board for Clinical Studies. Same for animal studies with IACUC, and that all has to be reviewed and approved before you can even order supplies, right? But in some places this may not be the case. Companies may not have, may not carry out such reviews, and so you got to be careful also not to fall into that trap. As an editor, I have access to a website, or actually a consortium of other editors. It's called COPE, and literally it's the COPE. It's the Committee on Publication Ethics, and this website or this site is a treasure trove of cases, because when editors cannot determine what to do next, they publish their anonymous questions on this forum, and editors from other journals will speak up and give advice on how to handle certain conflicts or certain cases. And some of the cases are ludicrous. I mean, there's so many. I don't want to say so many, but there are a lot of interesting cases out there, and I usually print out about 7 to 10 of those cases, give them to my students, and say, read it, right, or read the first one. Let's discuss what is happening here. Is there a concern? What are the concerns? Define where the concerns are, and how would you have gone about it, and what should we do? One of the fun stories that always gets people to laugh is an author who basically starts spamming a journal by repeatedly submitting his same article and insulting the editor. And so it got so bad that the editor didn't know what to do anymore, because the author would take his emails, alter the words in it, and then send it to his colleagues all over the world. So people were starting to ask questions.
Oh my.
They did not know where this person was because he used anonymous email accounts, and he just kept spamming the editorial office. So people gave advice and said, well, you could contact Yahoo, wherever they create their email addresses, or Gmail, and they may be able to do something about it. But I think in the end there was a postscript where the editor said, I just ignored everything. I didn't do anything, and eventually he just went away. So those are some of the issues that we talk about. Also conflicts of interest, financial, reviewing conflicts. If you're reviewing something that's from an author who you have a conflict with, or who you've had fighting words with in the past, I mean, that's you should excuse yourself from reviewing that. And I think you need to have that discussion with students and also with faculty, to be honest, for them to know what to do, and for them to take the right course of action.
That actually leads directly into the next question I was going to ask. With misconduct always being a concern in academics and in research, what supports, in addition to those sort of educational moments, do you feel best help students to prepare as they move and transition into their careers?
Well, it is certainly a concern, and I think that in the past 5 to 10 years, I would say that we have really woken up as to being compliant with ethical behavior. We've seen enough cases that have gotten into the news that the public starts to ask questions. What are we doing with the taxpayers' dollars at publicly funded universities, and who is looking over the science to make sure that these abuses don't take place? So I think starting with the NIH and with NSF, they started requiring that every investigator who applies for funding will guarantee that they adhere to certain guidelines in the ethical conduct in research. And over the years, every university, at least in the United States, has put in place a person, an ombudsman, a research integrity officer. We have one on this campus, Sarah Archibald. I know her very well because we've had a lot of fun with cases together. But I think it's important that there is a person and that they're visible too. That they're visible and that they're approachable. And I know that UMB has set up a hotline where you can also have anonymous tips for people behaving unethically, and it could be anything, right? I mean, all these different areas where people may do the wrong thing, or maybe if they do it intentionally or unintentionally, that someone can take a look at that and inform the faculty or the students what should be done or how it could be corrected.
Excellent. I was going to ask you how you encourage your students to address unethical behavior, but it sounds like you did already talk to us a little bit about that. So I'm going to ask why addressing unethical behavior is so important.
Well, actually, I want to add to the previous one,
Great.
How do you encourage your students? I mean, it's the same thing. If you see something, say something, right? I mean, It's as simple as that. I mean, if you see a package on the bus that you're on the light rail, you're going to say something. I mean, that's the right thing to do. So I think anecdotally, last week a student came into my office who I had just been teaching the ethics class. I was just done with that. And she came into my office. She's like, oh, Dr. Swaan, what do you think of this? And she had done a journal club for another class and determined that there were copied data from one paper to the next. I mean, it turned out that these were data that were in the main paper and then in the supplemental data. And so it didn't look, and we discussed it because, yes, it was duplicated, but again, it was one of these gray areas where did the investigators deliberately duplicate the data to pull the wool over our eyes and mislabel it? Or could they have just been more clear about what they exactly did? And I think that's the lesson that a lot of students need, is that you need to be clear about exactly what you're doing. I mean, if you're going to alter a figure, if you're going to alter data, tell them how you did it and why you did it. Outliers are normal, right? I mean, you may get a result that you don't expect. There's statistical methods to prove that they are indeed not the expected data. Something could have gone wrong that day. Maybe you forgot to add something to your buffers or to your experiment. But that doesn't mean that anything that doesn't fall in line with what you expect you should throw out. And I think that's something you need to teach people early on, because otherwise you get into this habit of only going in the direction that you want to go. And that's not good. And of course, there's a lot of pressure too these days, because you're only as good as your next grant, right? You're only as good as your next funding. So you're only as good as your next paper in science or nature. And if you see the number of retractions from the high impact journals such as Science and Nature, it's astonishing, because these are the high flyers. But if you're flying high, someone's going to be watching you. So you better check, dot your I's and cross your T's, because if you haven't done that, people are going to point it out, and you can fall very hard, and it will impact your career. And I think that's what people need to realize. It can impact your career for the rest of your life, right?
Definitely. Well, that's fantastic. I can't tell you how much I appreciate hearing your thoughts, and I have actually been to one of your RCR lectures on publication, and I just really appreciate the work that you do and the case studies and how to apply everything. It's magnificent. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you for joining us today. Office of Accountability and Compliance is open, accessible, and collaborative.